They laughed at her every day, not because she was weak, but because she was quiet. In the chow line, they mocked the butterfly tattoo on her arm, called it soft, called her a joke. She never answered back, never explained, never defended herself. They thought she was just a supply clerk, someone who pushed paper while real soldiers did the fighting. But there was a reason she kept her sleeves rolled up, a reason she never covered that tattoo, and a reason hardened men from a visiting special operations unit stopped laughing the moment they saw it, because that butterfly wasn't decoration, it was a warning. Before we begin, take a second to support the channel. Subscribe for more true military and veteran stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. These stories matter because the quiet ones are often the most powerful. The chow line stretched across the yard, boots grinding into the sun-baked dirt of Camp Hawthorne. Heat shimmered above the concrete, warping the air and shortening tempers. It was the kind of afternoon where patience ran thin and jokes cut sharper than usual. Private First Class Sarah Mitchell stood in line like everyone else, sleeves rolled just above her wrist, back straight, eyes forward. That was all it took. The butterfly tattoo on her forearm caught the attention of a group of infantry soldiers behind her. Black ink against pale skin, clean lines, delicate wings. It didn't match their idea of what a soldier should look like. One of them leaned forward, smirk creeping across his face. "What's she gonna do?" he said loudly. "Flutter at the enemy?" Laughter followed, not explosive, not cruel enough to draw a reprimand, just enough to sting, enough to make sure she heard it. Sarah didn't turn around, she didn't roll her eyes, didn't tighten her jaw, didn't say a word. Her tray stayed steady in her hands. Silence was her only defense. They thought they knew exactly who she was. They didn't, and that misunderstanding was about to cost them more than embarrassment. Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old and assigned to the logistics division at Camp Hawthorne. Her world wasn't firefights or night raids. It was clipboards, manifests, endless stacks of supply reports that most soldiers never thought about until something went missing. While others trained for combat, Sarah made sure they had the gear to survive it. Every morning she arrived early, boots polished to a mirror shine, bunk squared away with near-clinical precision, paperwork flawless. If a shipment went missing, Sarah found it. If a report was late, Sarah had finished it the night before. She never raised her voice, never complained, never cut corners, but in the eyes of most infantrymen, none of that mattered. To them, she wasn't a fighter, wasn't real army, just another supply clerk, someone who didn't belong in the field, someone whose quiet presence could be overlooked without a second thought. The contrast was obvious. The men who mocked her were loud, brash, convinced that worth was measured in calloused hands and combat patches. Sarah was the opposite. Soft-spoken, steady, humble. She didn't brag about past accomplishments, didn't push back when jokes were thrown her way. She simply endured them. And then there was the tattoo, a single butterfly, black ink spread across her forearm. To most, it looked out of place on a soldier. Feminine, fragile, a decoration that didn't belong beside a uniform and dog tags. In the chow hall, whispers always started when someone noticed it. "Spring break special?" someone would mutter. "What's next? Matching wings?" The laughter never seemed to touch her. Sarah never explained, not once. She kept her sleeves rolled just high enough that the ink was always visible. Whether it was stubbornness, pride, or something else entirely, no one knew. But she never defended it, never offered a story, never gave them what they wanted. To her fellow soldiers, it was a joke. To Sarah Mitchell, it was something else entirely. And the longer she stayed silent, the more dangerous their assumptions became. The first time it happened in front of a formation, Sarah told herself it didn't matter. They were standing in the yard for a routine briefing when a platoon sergeant caught sight of her tattoo. He smirked. Then he reached out. Before she could react, he grabbed her wrist and held it up for everyone to see. "Look at this," he said, voice dripping with amusement. "Private Mitchell here thinks she's at a butterfly garden." A ripple of laughter moved through the ranks. "What's this supposed to be?" he added. "Your spirit animal?" Sarah didn't pull her arm back, didn't flinch, didn't speak. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. The sergeant eventually dropped her wrist and moved on, but the damage lingered. From that moment on, she was fair game. The jokes followed her to the motor pool. One hot afternoon, 2 soldiers leaned against a Humvee, cigarettes dangling from their lips as Sarah walked past with a clipboard. "I'll put 20 on it," one of them said loudly. She couldn't load that truck without breaking a nail. The other chuckled. "You're on. No way she even knows where the tie-down points are." Sarah kept walking. She didn't fire back, didn't slow down, but in the reflection of the Humvee's side mirror, her eyes burned, just for a moment, before softening again. She disappeared into the warehouse. The laughter followed her. What they didn't realize was that someone else was starting to notice too. It got worse in the chow hall. She balanced her tray, careful as always, when a passing private brushed too close. The tray slipped. Metal clattered against the floor. Food scattered across the tiles. The hall erupted. Some jeered. One clapped sarcastically. "Nice work, Mitchell," someone called out. "Enemy's gonna surrender now for sure." Sarah knelt down slowly, picking up the pieces one by one. No curse words, no anger, just steady hands, slow breaths, silence. A medic bent down to help her. Sarah shook her head. She didn't want pity. She finished cleaning, left her tray behind, and sat at a corner table alone. That became her routine. Alone at meals, alone at the supply desk, long after others had gone to their bunks. The lights in her office burned late into the night, her pen scratching across paper. When soldiers passed by, they saw her hunched over letters, sealed in neat stacks, but never mailed. No one knew who she wrote to. No one asked. And if things had stayed that way, the silence might have swallowed her whole, because that was the day the convoy arrived, and with it, the first people who didn't laugh. The convoy rolled into Camp Hawthorne under a pale afternoon sky, tires grinding against the tarmac as dust clouds bloomed behind it. Vehicles came to a halt in clean formation. Doors opened. Boots hit the ground in near-perfect unison. A Navy Special Operations Detachment. They didn't joke, didn't shout, didn't look around like tourists. Their eyes moved slowly, deliberately, cataloging everything. Entrances, distances, people. Sarah Mitchell stood off to the side of the yard with her clipboard, sleeves rolled as always, head down as she recorded tail numbers and verified manifests. To most eyes, she was invisible, just another logistics clerk doing her job. But the laughter that usually followed her didn't come this time. The operators noticed it too. They noticed how the jokes stopped when they appeared, how soldiers who'd been loud moments earlier suddenly found reasons to look busy. And they noticed Sarah, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. A few of them exchanged glances, subtle, wordless. When a group of infantrymen nearby muttered something under their breath and snickered in her direction, the operators didn't laugh. They watched. They didn't say a word. Not then, but from that moment on, Sarah Mitchell wasn't just being ignored. She was being observed, and she felt it. Days blurred together at Camp Hawthorne. For most soldiers, it was routine. Training cycles, inspections, chow lines. For Sarah, it was a test of endurance, not of strength or skill, but of silence. Yet cracks began to show, small ones, easy to miss unless someone was paying attention. The first came late one evening near the women's barracks. A private passed by and noticed Sarah's locker door hanging open. Inside was a single photo taped neatly to the metal. At first glance it looked ordinary. A group of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in the desert, helmets on, faces obscured by dust, or maybe something more deliberate. The photo was worn at the edges, handled often, but one detail stood out: a patch on a sleeve, partially covered but unmistakable to anyone who knew special operations insignia. The private slowed, squinting. Before he could get a better look, the locker door closed softly. Sarah stood there, hand still resting on the metal. Their eyes met for half a second. She didn't look angry. She didn't look afraid. She just nodded once and walked away. The private never mentioned what he saw, but the image stayed with him. The second sign revealed itself under the harsh floodlights of the motor pool. Sarah was walking past a line of parked vehicles when the butterfly tattoo caught the light at just the right angle. What looked like simple wings during the day showed something more at night. Thin lines, precise, intentional, numbers woven into the design so subtly they vanished unless you were looking for them. Coordinates, unit identifiers, something exact. The soldiers who mocked her never noticed, but a visiting operator leaning against a Humvee did. His gaze lingered, his posture shifted. For the first time since arriving, something like surprise flickered across his face. Sarah felt it. She glanced down, saw where his eyes were, and without a word tugged her sleeve lower. Their eyes met. No nod, no acknowledgement, just understanding. He didn't say a word, but from that night on, his laughter never joined the others. The third moment came in the warehouse. A shipment arrived late, crates of newly issued weapons fresh off the line. Armorers gathered around, prying open lids and cataloging serial numbers. Sarah stepped forward with her clipboard. Without looking inside the crates, she began speaking. Model, weight, barrel length, optic compatibility. She rattled off the specifications before the lids were fully removed. One of the armorers stopped and stared at her. "How do you know that?" he asked. Sarah shrugged. "It's on the manifest," she said simply. But the paperwork hadn't been opened yet. The room went quiet. Someone laughed nervously, but the sound didn't land, because everyone there knew that kind of knowledge didn't come from reading forms. It came from experience. And suddenly, the jokes felt premature. The inspection came without warning. Word spread fast. A lieutenant was making surprise rounds through the motor pool. Soldiers scrambled to impose order on chaos. Straps tightened. Grease wiped away. Gear lined up in perfect rows. Sarah stood at her desk, clipboard in hand, calm as ever. The lieutenant's gaze swept the room and stopped on her. "You," he said, pointing. "Private Mitchell, step forward." The room stilled. Sarah obeyed, boots clicking against concrete. The lieutenant picked up an M4 carbine from a nearby rack and held it out. "Logistics, right?" he said. "Paperwork, supplies." A few soldiers smirked. "Let's see what you really know." This wasn't a fair test. Everyone knew it. Sarah didn't hesitate. She accepted the weapon, set it down on the table, and reached into her pocket. When she tied the cloth around her eyes, gasps rippled through the motor pool. Blindfolded. Her fingers moved. Bolt, extractor, firing pin. Each part laid out with quiet precision. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Metal clicked softly against the table. In under 2 minutes, the rifle lay stripped bare. An armorer folded his arms slowly. "I've seen guys take 5 times that long," he muttered. Sarah removed the blindfold and reassembled the weapon just as smoothly. The final click echoed through the room. Silence followed. Someone in the back finally spoke. "How do you know that?" Sarah picked up her clipboard. "It's in the manual," she said softly. No one believed her, and now no one was laughing. The convoy returned just after dawn. This time, the operators moved with even greater purpose. At the front walked their commander, a man shaped by decades of service and the kind of experiences that didn't make it into after-action reports. Sarah stood nearby, writing as usual. The commander's eyes swept the yard, then stopped, locked, on her arm, the butterfly. He froze. The operators behind him halted mid-step. Slowly, deliberately, the commander walked toward her. Sarah looked up, startled, fingers tightening around her clipboard. He stopped in front of her, straightened, and raised his hand in a crisp salute. The yard fell into stunned silence. No one understood what they were seeing, but every instinct in the air said something irreversible had just happened. Before we reach the moment that changed everything, take a second to reflect on why stories like this matter. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been judged by appearances instead of actions, if you've ever carried a burden in silence, then this story is for you. Subscribe for more military and veteran stories that honor the quiet strength, the unseen sacrifice, and the moments that remind us what true service really looks like. The salute hung in the air longer than anyone expected. No one spoke, no one moved. The yard, usually alive with noise, felt sealed in silence, as if even the heat had paused to watch. Sarah Mitchell stood frozen, clipboard pressed lightly against her chest. Her first instinct wasn't pride or relief. It was instinctive caution, the same discipline she'd carried for years. She didn't return the salute right away, not out of disrespect, but because she understood what moments like this could cost. The commander held his hand steady. His eyes never left hers. "You're still with us, Mitchell?" he asked. Quietly, her throat tightened. She gave the smallest nod, and with that single motion, something cracked open that could never be closed again. Murmurs rippled through the formation. Why was a Navy commander saluting a supply clerk? Why had the operators behind him gone rigid? Why did no one dare laugh? The commander finally lowered his hand and turned to face the gathered soldiers. "You think she's just logistics," he said, his voice calm but edged with memory. "You think that tattoo is decoration?" No one answered. He took a step forward. "Years ago," he continued, "in a valley most of you will never hear about, we were trapped, outnumbered, cut off, minutes from being wiped out." Sarah stared straight ahead. The commander didn't look at her now. He looked at them. "The only reason I'm standing here," he said, "the only reason any of my men made it home, is her." He pointed to Sarah. The words hit harder than gunfire. A hush fell deeper over the yard. Soldiers shifted their weight. Some swallowed. Others looked away, suddenly ashamed of the jokes they'd laughed at too easily. Sarah felt every eye on her. She wanted to disappear. Years earlier, she hadn't worn logistics insignia. She hadn't carried a clipboard. She'd been embedded intelligence, operating in places where names were stripped away and replaced with silence. Missions so classified, they were never logged in systems that could be accessed twice. Her call sign was never spoken aloud, and the butterfly had never been decoration. It was a mark, a symbol worn quietly by those who survived an operation that should have ended in disaster. A way to recognize one another without words. A reminder of a moment when information mattered more than bullets. The commander had been there, pinned down in that valley, comms failing, enemy movement closing in, every route compromised, until Sarah found one that wasn't. A pattern no one else had seen. A code buried inside. Noise. A decision made in the dark that rerouted an entire unit away from death. She hadn't fired a rifle. She hadn't dragged anyone to safety. But because of her, dozens of men walked out alive. And then she disappeared. No ceremony, no medals, no speeches, just reassignment, silence, and a butterfly inked where she'd never forget. The commander looked back at her now, and for the first time since arriving at Camp Hawthorne, Sarah felt the weight of the past pressing against the present. He raised his hand again. This time, it wasn't just him. One by one, the operators behind him followed. Boots snapped together, hands rose in unison, a wall of disciplined respect. Then the army officers. Then, hesitantly, the enlisted soldiers who had once laughed at her tattoo. The sound of boots aligning echoed across the yard. Sarah's chest tightened. She returned the salute, not sharply, not dramatically, but with a steadiness that carried years of restraint. For a heartbeat, hardened warriors saluted the woman they had dismissed. The butterfly that had been a target of mockery was now a banner of sacrifice. And still, Sarah didn't smile. When the salute ended, the silence remained. No one spoke. Breaking the moment felt like disrespect. The commander lowered his hand and stepped closer to her. "You've earned more than silence," he said quietly. "They should know who stands among them." Sarah shook her head gently. "I'm just doing my job, sir," she whispered. There was no speech after that, no applause, no demand for recognition, just the same quiet discipline she had always shown, and somehow that made it heavier. From that day forward, everything changed. No one mocked her in the chow line, no one joked about the butterfly. The soldiers who had laughed now stood a little straighter when she walked past. Their voices dropped, their eyes held respect instead of amusement. Stories began to spread, whispers at first, fragments of truth, passed quietly between bunks and guard posts, some exaggerated, some understated. Sarah never confirmed any of them. She didn't need to. She returned to her desk, to her manifests, to her late nights and sealed letters. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. She was no longer invisible. Weeks later, a young private approached her hesitantly in the supply office. "Ma'am," he said, unsure of the word. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Sarah looked up from her paperwork. She studied his face for a moment, then nodded once. That was all. No lecture, no absolution, just acknowledgement. And in that small exchange, he learned something no training manual could teach. Camp Hawthorne eventually moved on. Units rotated, convoys came and went. But the story stayed, not because Sarah told it, because others did, quietly, respectfully, when they thought it mattered. She became a legend without trying to be one, not for her strength, not for her skill, but for the reminder she left behind. That true strength isn't loud, that courage doesn't always carry a weapon, that the quietest person in the room may be carrying the heaviest history, and if you ever find yourself laughing at what you don't understand, remember the butterfly, because sometimes the softest symbol marks the sharpest edge, and sometimes the warrior you overlook is the one who already saved your life. Time didn't stop at Camp Hawthorne. It never does. Convoys continued to roll in and out. Orders changed, units rotated, new faces arrived with the same sharp confidence and untested certainty the old ones once carried. To anyone looking from the outside, the base returned to its normal rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, something had shifted. It showed in the way conversations paused when Sarah Mitchell passed by, not because people were afraid of her, but because they were aware that silence didn't mean weakness, aware that the smallest presence could carry the deepest history. Sarah didn't acknowledge the change. She arrived early, left late, did her job the same way she always had. The butterfly tattoo remained visible, not as a challenge, not as a reminder, but as a quiet truth that no longer needed defending. And for those who had witnessed the salute, it was impossible to unsee what it meant. A month later, a new rotation of soldiers arrived, fresh uniforms, loud voices, familiar jokes. Sarah stood at the supply counter, organizing manifests, when one of them noticed the ink on her arm. He smirked. "What's with the butterfly?" he asked casually. the way someone tests a boundary without realizing it exists. The room went still, not because Sarah reacted, because everyone else did. Someone cleared their throat. Another shifted uncomfortably. The young soldier noticed too late. Sarah looked up, met his eyes, and gave a polite, neutral smile. "It's just a tattoo," she said. "Nothing more. No explanation." And somehow, that answer carried more weight than any story could have. The soldier nodded slowly and said nothing else. Later that night, he asked someone about it, and the way the answer was given made him listen. The sealed letters stayed in her drawer. Some nights, Sarah took one out and read it again, not for nostalgia, for grounding. They reminded her of who she had been and who she had chosen to become afterward. She could have stayed where the adrenaline lived, where danger felt like purpose. Instead, she chose quiet service, because after seeing how quickly lives could end, she understood something others hadn't yet learned. Most battles are won long before the fighting starts, and most heroes never fire a shot. The SEAL detachment eventually rotated out. Before they left, the commander stopped by the supply office. No entourage, no ceremony, just a brief pause at her desk. "Good to see you standing," he said. Sarah nodded. "You too, sir." That was all they said. They didn't need more. Some bonds aren't strengthened by words. They survive on shared silence. And as he walked away, Sarah felt something close to closure. But not quite. Because some chapters don't close. They just settle. Years later, someone would try to write the story down. It wouldn't work. Too much of it lived between the lines, in moments that didn't photograph well, in silences that couldn't be quoted. The records would show a logistics clerk. The paperwork would be perfect. The truth would remain mostly invisible, and that was exactly how Sarah wanted it. On her last day at Camp Hawthorne, she stood in the yard one final time. Same concrete, same sun, same wind carrying dust across the ground. A few soldiers nodded as they passed her. One saluted, not sharply, not officially, but with quiet respect. Sarah returned it and kept walking. The butterfly caught the light once more. Still misunderstood by those who hadn't been there, still powerful to those who had. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think differently about the quiet ones, if it reminded you that courage doesn't always raise its voice, then please, don't let it end here. Subscribe, not for the algorithm, not for numbers, but because stories like this disappear when no one listens, because the real heroes rarely speak for themselves, because if we don't tell these stories, they fade, and people like Sarah Mitchell deserve to be remembered. Stay with us. Help us keep their silence from being forgotten.